Welcome back to Antisocial Studies. Today I want to talk about the British Empire's increasing influence in Asia at the turn of the 19th century. Why? Well, why not? I mean, it's really interesting, but also because I just picked a new book for my historical fiction book club, Babel by R.F. Kuang. This novel begins in Canton, China, but then it very quickly takes us to London and Oxford to show the inner workings of the growing British Empire. The only thing that makes this book fiction is that the growing source of Britain's growing power is not coal or industrialization, but magic, practiced through the translation of languages and silverwork. It's beautiful. You're going to love it. So before you dive into the 1830s, let's get us all up to speed about what's been going on historically that might help us understand the beginning of the story. No spoilers at all. I'm just going to help you contextualize where and when the book begins. Side note, join me for a book club meeting and a conversation between historians about Babel on Sunday, December 8th. Details are in the description below. So in the early 19th century, the British Empire was at a significant turning point, shaped both by its recent losses and ongoing global conflicts. So here are some recent events to be aware of. Number 1, the loss of the American colonies. The American Revolution had resulted in Britain's defeat and the independence of its 13 colonies in North America, and this marked a major geopolitical loss for the British Empire, reducing its presence really in the Western Hemisphere. However, Britain is quickly going to shift its focus to other regions, such as Asia, Africa, to maintain its global dominance. Number 2, the Napoleonic Wars. The early 19th century was also defined by Britain's role in these wars, a series of conflicts with France under Napoleon Bonaparte. Despite the massive costs of war, Britain emerged victorious and more powerful, having successfully defended its interests in Europe and overseas. And the British Royal Navy played a crucial role in Britain's ability to maintain control of its empire and protect its global trade routes. The defeat of Napoleon in 1815 solidified Britain's status as the world's preeminent naval power and allowed it to expand its colonial reach, especially in Africa and Asia. And number 3, tons of wealth from the slave trade. So by the early 19th century, Britain had built immense wealth through the transatlantic slave trade. British merchants, particularly in cities like Liverpool and Bristol, profited heavily from the forced transportation of enslaved Africans to work on plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas. The whole empire's economy, especially sugar, cotton, and other colonial goods, was intertwined with the labor of enslaved people. However, this wealth was beginning to come under increasing moral scrutiny thanks to a growing abolitionist movement. So in the early 19th century, the British Empire was a global force, but is still recovering from the loss of its American colonies, bolstered by its military victories in the Napoleonic War, and with a ton of wealth to spend from the slave trade. This is where they turn their eyes to Asia. So with Babel, we jump into the eastern half of the world and the British Empire's growing influence in Asia. Let's talk a bit about what's been going on in two of the largest and wealthiest regions in world history, India and China. From 1757 to 1858, the British East India Company effectively governed large parts of the Indian subcontinent during a period known as company rule. During this time, India was not a unified country under a single central government. It was kind of a mosaic of various princely states and regions. They were all theoretically under the sovereignty of the Mughal emperor, but mostly ruled by local elites and royalty who kind of maintained power over their local territories. The British East India Company initially entered India just as a trading entity, but soon it expanded its influence through strategic alliances and military interventions. The company capitalized on the political fragmentation and conflicts between local rulers, and they used that to assert more control. By playing different states and rulers against one another, the British East India Company slowly gained dominance over key regions, securing trading privileges and political authority. The local princely states were often kept as nominal rulers, but the company exerted real power behind the scenes, controlling administration, military forces, and taxes in some of these territories. So the Indian subcontinent is technically free, with various substates competing for power under the umbrella of the Mughal Empire, but in reality, the British are increasing their influence through the British East India Company and its trading relationships with local rulers. Something similar is going on in China. Different from India, China was ruled in a more unified fashion under the Qing dynasty. Because of this, the Chinese rulers were able to control the influence of foreign trade and restrict it to certain areas of the country, at least more successfully than in India. A century earlier, when the Qing dynasty took power from the Ming, they initially banned all maritime trade except through the Portuguese-controlled port city of Macau. But eventually the Qing emperor allowed limited foreign trade in coastal cities, with Canton, modern-day Guangzhou, emerging as the most important trading hub for Western merchants, especially the British. In 1686, the Qing Emperor established the Ocean Trading House in Canton to handle all Western trade, and this evolved into the Canton system, where all foreign trade was conducted exclusively through a body of Chinese merchant authorities called the Kuang. These Kuang merchants were licensed by the Qing government to manage all trade between Chinese and foreign merchants in Canton. Under this system, foreign merchants were confined to live and do business in a specific neighborhood along the Pearl River in Canton. These merchant communities were known as factories, but they were not actual factories, but trading posts where merchants from different countries could reside and trade. Foreigners, including the British, were not allowed to move further into China, and their interactions were strictly limited to trading periods that were set by the Qing. As the volume of trade, particularly in tea and silver, increased, more Westerners, including British officials and merchants, started settling in Canton, working in roles like customs officers. However, tensions grew as the British sought more access to Chinese markets and cities beyond Canton. James Flint, a British merchant, notably challenged the restrictions by trying to expand British trade into other cities, which upset both the Kuang and the Qing authorities. Additionally, underground missionary activity and British gunboat diplomacy along the Chinese coast further strained their relations. So by 1759, the Qing government had enacted stricter controls with the policy of vigilance toward foreign barbarian relations, confining foreign merchants to the 13 factories neighborhood in Canton and limiting trade to certain times of the year. So as a result, by the early 19th century, trade between China and Britain was almost exclusively conducted through Canton, and both sides heavily regulated the flow of goods. The British East India Company held a monopoly on British trade with China, conducting its dealings strictly through the Kuang merchants. The British, as the most powerful maritime empire in the world, are not happy with this restricted access to Chinese markets, but there's not much they can do about it. They have essentially nothing of value that the Chinese want besides silver, and this is what we call an unfavorable balance of trade with China. Here's how the Qianlong Emperor put it in 1792 in an edict meant for King George III of Great Britain. Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its borders. There is therefore no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce. That's awkward. And the British were looking to change that balance of power. The Macartney Mission of 1793 marked Britain's first formal diplomatic attempt to alter the trade relationship with Qing China, signaling Britain's growing focus on expanding its influence in Chinese trade. The mission was intended to convince the Qing Emperor to open up additional Chinese ports to British merchants and establish more favorable trade agreements. However, it was like a complete failure. The emperor viewed the British as just another tributary state rather than an equal trading partner, rejecting all of their demands. And Macartney and his delegation were also offended by the expectation that they performed the kowtow, a traditional act of submission to the emperor. This diplomatic tension really foreshadows future conflicts between Britain and China. So throughout the early 1800s, the British increasingly ignored Chinese trade restrictions and began pushing back more forcefully. They stationed troops in Macau, violating agreements between China and Portugal. And even during the War of 1812, British forces attacked American ships in Canton Harbor, demonstrating their growing willingness to challenge the established order in Chinese ports. Like I mentioned earlier, the Chinese economy was largely self-sufficient and had little demand for British goods. The Chinese insisted on payment in silver for their highly sought-after tea, silk, and porcelain, and this created a trade imbalance unfavorable to Britain, as the country's silver reserves were finite and being rapidly depleted. So when the book begins, we start in the city of Canton, a Chinese trading city where foreigners, especially the British, have a lot of influence. This is not direct imperialism. China is still its own empire ruled by the Qing dynasty in Peking, today Beijing. But they are increasingly dealing with foreigners looking for ways to get better access to all the wealth within China. And when the book begins, the British are desperately looking for some way to flip their trade imbalance. They need to find something that the Chinese markets want and only they have access to. To be continued in the book. Hope you enjoy it and hope to see you on December 8th. Like and subscribe and go join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.